right. So appreciate being able to talk here. I'm actually standing in for Dr. Guillermo Rosa from the University of Wisconsin, who's the lead primary investigator on this project. It was funded by the USDA IDEAS program, so it's an interdisciplinary engagement in animal systems. The government loves to make new acronyms, and so we benefit from that one. But it's a really neat project that's a collaboration between a number of universities, animal geneticists, as well as Angus Genetics Incorporated, who is a big partner in this. And we're just kicking this project off. It's been going for 3 or 4 months, but wanted to sort of give an overview of where we're headed, some of the value that we see in some of the different angles that we're taking in this research to try and identify more adapted cattle, particularly in moving past just tying an animal to a zip code and asking what's different about this zip code from another. Understanding that management has every bit as big of a factor on an animal's performance and interacts with genetics probably just as much as actual natural environment does. So some of the tack that we're using to do that we'll describe here. And this talk will be pretty short, so I'll get you out in time. Buses don't leave till 5, so we'll be sure to close things up before then. But yeah. This is a slide that Guillermo always uses, and I use a very similar slide in extension programming all the time, where we talk about phenotype being some combination of an animal's genetics and environment. That's going to vary, of course, for the trait, but he breaks it out into the different omics, and we're entering this era where genomics is something that we're all very familiar with, right? It's been around for a couple decades. We're comfortable with it. It's in the mainstream. Our plant friends are talking a whole lot more about phenomics now. So they've got the ability to take an aerial drone, right, and fly it over a field and understand that individual place in the field and the individual cultivar that's planted there, how that performance is in a number of different ways, right? Our dairy friends are using mid-infrared spectrometry. I haven't slept very much this week, to scan milk samples and find indicator phenotypes within that milk sample that would suggest something along the lines of energy partitioning, methane emission. Dr. Christine Bays will talk a little bit about this tomorrow in her talk, I'm sure. But again, phenomics, there are all sorts of different things that we can measure in a high throughput way now. And so this project takes a little bit of a look at phenomics in a number of ways. Genetics, of course, is the thing that we're all familiar with. We're at BIF. Genetics is the driver of progress on our front. But the thing that this project really leans into is this idea of enviromics, right? So take everything that has to do with an animal's environment, right? Genomics is just taking all of the genes. This is taking all of the different environments, sub-environments, microenvironments that surround this animal, whether they come from the climate, right? Was it hot or cold this year? Did we get enough rain? All the way down to the management level, right? Did this calf receive a vaccine? How is the grazing managed on this operation? Knowing that all of those things in their own way and the interactions between genetics and environment will feed into that animal's phenotype. So this is really the way that we frame this whole project, is understanding the interconnectivity of phenotype, genotype, and environment through their 3 respective omicses. And so, again, the idea is to optimize the genetics in environmental combination alongside management, right? So there's sort of 2 schools of thought about how we attack this, right? Do we breed animals that are good in every single environment? Or do we find specific animals that fit specific environments, or find animals that fit specific environments and management combinations, right? So this is the tack that this takes, is placing animals in their optimal environment to succeed. And there, of course, there's a good bunch of Nelore cattle down here. It's a vast majority Brazilian team that we've assembled, as I'll show here in a second. And so when we're talking about genotype by environment interactions, this is something that we're all probably familiar with, right? In the absence of G by E, right? So if we're looking across the x-axis at an environmental gradient, so we'll say a less favorable environment up to a more favorable environment, and we look at animals' actual performance, in the absence of any genotype by environment interaction, that performance is stable across all of the different environments that animal's subjected to. In this case, right, we have the environment has a positive effect on these individuals, but they stay equidistant from each other as we look across environments, right? So no real advantage to this animal over this animal that's environmental specific. But these bottom two are where we start to see the effects of G by E come into play, right? So in these more favorable environments, this animal has a much larger advantage than this animal, but they're a lot closer as we get back maybe in the lower input environments or the less intensive management on this x-axis. And then G by E gets really, really hairy when we start to get these crazy re-rankings as we look across environmental gradients. So in this case, the blue animal in our stressful environment is optimally built to succeed. You put them in a good environment, right, and things fall off. This would be a rare case, but something that certainly happens. The important thing here is when re-ranking occurs, right, when the decision that you would make based on say a breeding value of these bulls is different based on the environmental context, all of a sudden, this is when we really, really need to be accounting for this as we're making selection decisions. I think that Dr. Decker did a great job today explaining the difficulties of making predictions that are environment aware. Integrating this work is very, very tough. It's at a nuts and bolts level, quite computationally intensive as well. But I think that there's enough evidence across our industry to know that the G by E is there. It's important. And when we layer management on top of that and start to ask about placing animals in their optimal management context, that's when we can really squeeze a lot more performance out of the cattle that we're breeding if we're doing it in a precision sort of way. And so this just sort of breaking down a couple of the ways that we've attacked this. And again, Jared's talk this morning did a great job of exploring this, right? The general way that we've done it is with a single trait and a single environmental variant, right? And the sort of, I guess, technical term, right? We use these reaction norms. So we ask, genotype across environmental variable, how does the slope of that line change effectively? And that tells us a little bit about how that animal's genes will work across a number of environments. Heat stress, for good reason, is probably the most studied of all of these environmental stressors and the genetic interactions between them, particularly as we look into poultry and swine populations. A fair bit of heat stress G by E work has gone on in a number of contexts here. This is from Guillerme's group, looking at those genetic predictions across an environmental gradient and seeing a fair bit of re-ranking amongst these Nelore bulls when they're modeling environment alongside genetics there. And then I think that Jared's comments this morning as well about adaptive traits. If we want instant wins right now that are collectible, deployable, and selectable on, right? Collecting these environmental indicator traits and churning out genetic predictions, hair shedding being the best example, that's one of our best immediate ways to make some progress on breeding more adapted animals to stressful environments. So again, whether it's hair shed in the fescue belt, pap at elevation, I think there's a ton of good stuff that we can still do in the area of identifying those adaptive traits. But what we really haven't done and what this project is working to do is trying to contextualize the environment as deeply as we can, right? So measure everything possible and then analyze that in a multivariate way. And luckily, this team has a bunch of people. We talk about AI a lot nowadays in universities. Animal science departments have talked about AI for a long time. But again, we're starting to have the tools and the computational power to do this multivariate work, right? So analyze all of these things in tandem, refine the things that are actually important. Are there 4 or 5 things that if we knew about an operations management that we could actually say with some degree of confidence the management intensity of an operation? So that's really the big piece of what we're trying to drill down in is take all the data that we can from satellite imagery, from breeder collected survey data, all the way down to the basic management reports that we get from our breeders as they register and report phenotypes, and distill that down to the most important pieces of information to try and to try and model management alongside environment and their interactions with an animal's genetics. This was a slide that Guillermo gave me, and I'm far from the most competent statistician. So these are tools and modeling approaches that Guillermo's group has used in the past to model G by E, but particularly, right, we're trying to explore this interaction term in a general mixed linear model. They've done a fair bit of work in the multi-trait model space, so that's something that has been going on, understanding genetic correlations and correlations between those traits and their interactions with environment. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about reaction norms a second ago. But I want to speak really quickly to enviromics. This is a new term, was a new term to me when I was approached about this project. But the idea is not so different from genomics, right? Genomics, we've figured out that we're able to represent the entire cattle genome to some degree with about 50,000 evenly spaced high-frequency markers. Enviromics isn't terribly different, but it's using all of these different sources of data to represent the holistic environment, right? So I did some work in my PhD with 3 climate variables, right? Temperature, humidity, and elevation. Those are 3 pretty good predictors, and we can break the U.S. into some sensical regions and general climate zones using just those 3 variables. The idea with enviromics is that we can do this at a much, much finer scale and much, much deeper, right? So we've got all sorts of invaluable long-term climate data down to the minute in a lot of areas, and to the day and sort of meter resolution in others. But the big thing that I think sort of layers on here is past just climate. Can we use satellite imagery and other technologies along those lines to represent with a little bit more accuracy how that animal's grazing situation might be? I've got a picture here in a second. I'm sure that we've all seen it. There can be a huge amount of variation in the amount of forage that's available at the same zip code, right? And that doesn't come out when we refine the U.S. In these sort of hard and fast climate variables, right, and group them. So there's a level of precision, a level of depth that I think that a number of these other representations of an animal's environment can help us refine here. And each animal, each environment gets one of these envirotypes. A really nice review paper here that you can read a little bit more about. But this basically allows us to have a smooth gradient of environments as we look across at each of these different operations. Enviromics is very much in play in the plant breeding world. Again, Jared mentioned this, so I'll echo his comments, right? We can plant the same genetic individual in lots of different areas and see how they perform, right? Modeling G by E in plants is quite easy. It's much more difficult in cattle. But again, enviromics has been big for them as they start to get down to the fine-grained details of a plant's environment, right? Not just the number of days where they've got enough sunlight, right? That's a big predictor of plant environment interactions. But from soil type to cover crops that have been planted over the last X number of years, they can get really, really fine-grained and identify with more precision these breeding zones. Recommend, so get to this point where we're doing support. We've got support tools that are going out to producers and growers in the context of plants. And then eventually, as we layer genetic prediction, an environment in plants have a really, really good understanding of the underlying physiology in these individuals, their crop growth models are quite accurate, right? So knowing a little bit about a plant's environment, their genetic potential, and then all the inputs that could happen, you can get a pretty robust crop growth model that comes out the side that allows for even more precise decision support from both an environment and a management perspective. So this is just a little bit about the project. I'll sort of go into the big picture stuff and where we're at the moment. So this is a representation of where Angus cattle are being registered in the U.S. As of a couple years ago. So they're pretty ubiquitous. You'd be hard pressed to find an animal other than cattle that lives in as diverse an array of environments as cattle in the United States, right? From deserts to the high plains to the swamps to the fescue belt, there are cattle, and in particular Angus cattle, everywhere that we look. So a really nice sort of model system to understand these genetics by environment interactions because of their widespread nature across the U.S. And so, again, my big question in this project, and the thing that we've been talking about the most lately, is what does a zip code miss, right? So as we get a zip code that's attached to a breeder number, and we attach that to an individual animal, and we say, this is that animal's environment, right? We can pull in this data from the zip code. What does that tell us, and what does it not tell us? So again, we have the benefit of capturing this long-term climate data that's very, very important and valuable. We can maybe even get some generalized vegetation information, but again, it doesn't tell me anything about how those animals are being managed on one side of the fence versus the other. The animals that are being managed in this system versus this system are going to have vastly different phenotypic outcomes. Those get sucked up in contemporary group, right? But it'd be very, very useful for us as we model interactions to be able to pull that management out as well as environment, and let contemporary group suck up that sort of individual animal or management group level information that we miss when we just factor in and look at interactions between an individual's genetics and their zip code's climate variables. So this project has three overarching objectives. Is a big collaboration between the University of Wisconsin, who leads this, the University of Georgia, Tennessee, Purdue University, Michigan State, and of course our partners at AGI. And just looking at these names reminded me of the first Zoom meetings we had about this project. Dr. Huang and Dr. Johnson hadn't joined the team yet. And I realized that I was the only reason that they weren't speaking Portuguese on our Zoom calls. It's a team full of very, very good Brazilian animal breeders, some of the best in the world. So it's been fun to get to work through this and think about this system with them. But effectively, where we're at right now is generating a huge data lake, which is a new term to me. In pipelines to analyze all of this environmental and satellite data that's starting to flow in. Dr. Huang at Wisconsin is a world-leading expert in understanding and mining satellite imagery. So he's done a lot of work in the crop world and the cover crop world, projecting biomass from these sort of public data sets. And that's going to be very, very important for us as we attempt to model these environments in a really fine scale way. And then the other piece of that is characterizing U.S. beef cattle production systems. And that's the really tricky one, and the one that Dr. Val D'Souza at Michigan State and I have started to tackle, which is a large-scale survey of Angus breeders trying to understand the most informative pieces of an individual operations management that we could potentially model and look for interactions in as we drill into this data in the future. So I'll have a couple more words about the survey, and we're certainly working alongside AGI, Angus breeders. I had a good conversation with a number of people here at NCBA trying to refine what questions we need to be asking to be able to concretely characterize the management intensity of an operation. And then there's a whole ensemble of different approaches to try and model G by E in this system. So again, we have a number of these folks that have expertise in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and they're really, really excited to get their hands on a deep data set. So a data set that has lots of animals. We love numbers in animal breeding, but also very, very deep information on the environmental level for each of these individual animals. And then Dr. Brito's group at Purdue University is doing some work on developing novel indicators for animal resilience through phenotyping phenotypically divergent animals or genetically divergent animals. Most of this surrounding heat stress, which is of big interest to Dr. Brito and Johnson at Purdue University. And so, again, we're leaning on the wealth of data that's at Angus Genetics Incorporated. And it's spread across the U.S. We're starting off in this first draft using all of the maternal plus herds. So that's going to be our most reliable data, whole herd reporting. But in particular, as we start to drill into phenotypes, we certainly would expect to see some G by E and G by M in growth traits. We'd expect that to be even larger as we drill into some of these more fertility related traits, whether that be heifer pregnancy or their functional longevity, EPD, so on and so forth. So again, we're working on a series of surveys and mining data at the moment through these satellite imagery databases and long-term climate data hubs, and then a number of different approaches towards working to refine which of these indicators is the most important for us to model, where do the interactions exist, and where is there just not a whole lot of genetics by environment or management interaction. And then, of course, extension is a big part of this. So I'm running the extension arm of this and interacting with our Angus producers throughout the course of the project. And so our big question, right, is how do you understand the management at an individual operations level? And it's really tough. We can pull contemporary group solutions out, right? So ask when we fit that fixed effect in our animal model, right? What do we pull out that contemporary group is responsible for? But within there, we're very interested in what each of these little pieces is worth, right? So we've been working on a survey that comprehensively at the individual operation level helps us understand management intensity in a number of different areas, from how producers manage forage and grazing, down to health protocols, reproduction and advanced reproductive technologies, even down to the business decisions, right? So what percent of your income comes from cattle, right? That's a big one, particularly when we think about small commercial operations and their decision making. But even at this level, things like technology adaptation and how producers use genetics probably also tell us something about the intensity with which they're managing their herds. And so I guess with that, I'll skip over this last one. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on things that I don't know a ton about, but a number of different ways that this really competent group of animal breeders and myself are working to model G by E and G by M in tandem with one another, with the idea, of course, being that we can help make more targeted breeding decisions, placing the right animals in the right environmental context to succeed. So with that, thanks for listening. Angus producers, we're hoping to roll this survey out in late July or August. There will be plenty of communication across Angus channels in this. We're hoping to maybe do a webinar at some point to give some more information and context about what this looks like and what it'll look like in the future. Reach out to me with any questions. If you have any suggestions, if you think we're crazy, you can reach out to Dr. Rosa and tell him that. But appreciate you sticking around here.